Good morning, colleagues and comrades. Thank you all for joining us here today. The C19 People's Coalition Cash Transfers Working Group, as well as the Institute for Economic Justice, have gathered us here in this urgent press conference on the need to extend social relief measures for the poor, given that the socioeconomic crisis created by the pandemic is far from over. The C19 People's Coalition is an emerging civil society collective seeking to ensure that South Africa's response to the COVID-19 crisis is one that is rooted in social justice and democratic principles and recognizes our duty to prioritize those who are most vulnerable, who face the pandemic with hunger, weakened immune systems, and poor access to housing, health care, and social safety nets. The C19 People's Coalition has run a campaign called #PayTheGrants, and this is a critical component of that work. The Institute for Economic Justice is a progressive economic think tank with the objective to provide economic policymakers and social forces with access to progressive economic material as a basis for concrete interventions. I will now give the floor to Sherry Akala, who will read the statement today.
Thank you so much, Comrade Busi. The statement that I will read has been endorsed by almost 80 civil society organizations. And as the Pay the Grants campaign, we encourage you to share it on social media and continue to endorse it. We will share it in the chat later on, but I'm going to read it out to you. Civil society demands that the government provide support to the most vulnerable in this moment of crisis. Extend and increase both the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant and the Caregivers Grant to 585 Rand per month until we have a comprehensive plan for guaranteed basic incomes. South Africa has an estimated population of 15 million people with no or little income. The SRD and Caregivers grants, along with top-ups to other grants, were rolled out to address immediate hunger and poverty exacerbated by the pandemic. For the combined 12.7 million people receiving the SRD and caregiver grants, it has been a lifeline. The NIDS-CRAN data has shown that receipt of the grant has been pro-poor and has helped stave off hunger, while the caregiver grant has been especially important for supporting women-headed households. Despite these benefits, millions of people have been unjustly excluded from receiving the SRD grant due to the conditionalities attached to it. The SRD grant remains insufficient to cover basic food costs and is even less when shared amongst household members. There have also been administrative failures from SASSA and the Department of Social Development. We witnessed people sleeping in lines overnight in the cold outside SAPO and SASSA offices, only to be turned away the next morning. The gross exclusions can be attributed to challenges with the online and administrative processes, such as applications being verified on a monthly basis against outdated processes and databases, delays and glitches with payments, and corruption within government departments. Furthermore, applicants received unclear or no communication from SASSA, and the appeals process is fraught with problems. The most urgent priority for the government right now is to continue and improve these emergency measures. Now is not the time to cut back. Currently, approximately 70% of adults live below the upper bound poverty line of 1,268 Rand per person per month. In June 2020, 37% of people ran out of money for food. The widespread poverty experienced by so many has played a significant role in how the mental health crisis has been exacerbated by the pandemic, with symptoms of depression. The pandemic is far from over, and we could be entering a second wave of infections. Even before the devastation of COVID-19, South Africa was the most unequal country in the world, and this pandemic has only made things worse. Right in the midst of an economic, health, and inequality crisis, and the prospect of finding jobs is near impossible. A worst unemployment disaster in the history of our democracy, as people lose even the most meager incomes. The SRD grant has brought millions of previously excluded people into the social security system. It has provided crucial support for millions directly and has indirectly benefited many more. Job losses have affected underpaid workers, women, informal workers, and those in rural areas the most, and the primary claimants of the Caregivers grant have been women. We have seen the gender wage gap double for poorer workers over the period, which is why the October 7th shutdown protest centered the demand for gender equality. We believe that the extension of the Caregivers grant will help cushion the worst backlash of the pandemic against women specifically. Without immediate intervention, these benefits will be terminated at the end of October, causing a humanitarian crisis with approximately 6.8 million people plunged below the poverty line. Thus, both grants must be extended as a matter of urgency. Based on available estimates and assumptions of 5.6 million and 7.1 million, respectively, at current levels of access, the extension of both the SRD grant and the Caregiver grant at 585 Rand per month will cost a combined 37 billion Rand. At a fraction of spending proposals under consideration, this is a clear test of whether the government puts people before capital. All available information suggests that the government has decided not to extend the grants at the end of October. Government's decision to terminate the relief measures is both irresponsible and reprehensible given the socio-economic realities of our country. We believe that this decision must be reversed as a matter of urgency. We urge government to fulfill its constitutional obligation to provide relief to the poor. We call on government to extend both the SRD grant and Caregivers allowance by at least 5 months until the end of the financial year, March 2021, increase the SRD grant and the Caregiver allowance grant to the food poverty line of 585 Rand per month, reassess the criteria for accessing the SRD grant to provide administrative problems as a matter of urgency. Social welfare measures must be put in place for those who have borne the worst brunt of this pandemic. The fact that the supplementary budget in June has not mandated the extension of the SRD and Caregiver grants indicates that the forthcoming adjustment budget in October will likely not provide for this. National Treasury has stated in different fora, including NEDLAC, that it is not considering this option. This reflects the South African government's total disconnect from its people's struggles. This failure to meet the above demands would deepen the crisis that we face. There can be no recovery for the country's people or its economy without protecting the most vulnerable members of our society. The extension of these grants are critical until we have a comprehensive plan for basic income guarantees. Again, this statement has been endorsed by almost 80 organizations and more. Please do endorse the statement and join the Pay the Grants campaign and other initiatives that aim to put this issue on the national agenda. This has been an urgent press conference. So in the matter of 24 hours, we've had many people sign on, and this really describes the urgency of the issue that we're raising. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you all. Thank you, Shara Kala, who's the C19 People's Coalition Cash Transfers Working Group member. Thank you for those statements. We will now be joined by a number of speakers who will speak on the statement itself. First, I'd like to call Advocate Thuli Madonsela, who's the former public protector, who will give us her remarks.
Hi. Thank you, Program Director, and thank you to the Coalition for the privilege to participate in today's proceedings. It is courageous of the Coalition and the Institute for Economic Justice to take this stance at a time when finances are low. It is very easy to offload what is easy to offload. And of course, the poor are always the first to be considered to be dispensable. On my own behalf, and on behalf of the Social Justice Chair at Stellenbosch University, I support this initiative. We didn't have an opportunity to pull together those who have been working with us specifically to monitor what happens under the coronavirus COVID-19. We brought together the academic community and those who are working on law and justice under the Social Justice COVID-19 Monitoring Alliance, which is SCOPRA. And therefore, we haven't consulted at that level. But what I want to say is I support this initiative because South Africa can be a truly great nation if it were to harness the full potential of its people and natural resources. And at the core of the nation's strategy to harness its full potential is to leave no one behind. And we applaud the South African government, which was hit by the coronavirus COVID-19 at a time when it was at its knees when it comes to the economic downturn in the world, the consequences of corruption, and generally a slow growing economy. But despite these, it did extend this grant that we're here to discuss, a carers grant, and looking after the most vulnerable in society. Going forward, as we look at the recovery, we have to understand that the impact of coronavirus COVID-19 and the lockdown cannot be ended overnight. The impact of the lockdown and the prevention of people from earning an income is going to be with us for quite some time. And therefore, retaining the carers grant and the basic income grant is extremely important. But we've also learned from the NIDCRAM study that this has not only been a cushion to people from plunging into extreme poverty. Getting this income has also helped regenerate local economies, because when people are getting these grants, they tend to spend that money in local economies that have also been devastated by the lockdown rules. As a country, our courts have told us, in many cases, particularly S versus Makwanyane, that Ubuntu is part of who we are, which is I am because we are interconnected. My survival as a human being is dependent on your survival, because together we're better against everything that stands against us. And keeping these grants is part of Ubuntu or human solidarity. Yes, it's going to be tough to keep these grants in an economy that has not just been battered by the coronavirus, COVID-19, and the lockdown rules. It already was battered by corruption, fraud, and all sorts of things. It also had been battered during apartheid, and therefore, whilst it was recovering corruption and other forms of maladministration, battered the economy, and then comes the coronavirus, COVID-19. And therefore, we're not suggesting that our economy has this opulence that would allow it to look after everyone. However, human solidarity increases our ability to survive as a nation. And therefore, investing in these people as part of Ubuntu, investing in those among us who are left behind is an investment in all of us. And just lastly, as Shahira just reminded us, if we withdraw this investment, we would be asking the women of this country and the girls of this country to bear the burden, because there is nothing that is without a cost. All we'll be doing if we're withdrawing these grants, we would be withdrawing the burden from the shoulders of the state and therefore from the shoulders of everyone, and taking this burden and putting it squarely on the shoulders of women and girls. And that's improper, that's unconstitutional, that's a violation of social justice, but that is something that we would live to regret, because as long as there's injustice somewhere, there can't be sustainable peace anywhere. So on my own behalf and on behalf of the Social Justice Chair, I fully endorse the retention of this grant until the end of the financial year, and then reviewing at that stage, what do we do to make sure that no one is left behind? Thank you.
Thank you, Advocate Thuli Madonsela. We'll now have to the floor Comrade Zwelinzima Vavi, who is the General Secretary of the South African Federation of Trade Unions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Busi, and thank you very much to the panelists who are addressing this press conference today. And good morning to everybody that has joined this emergency press conference. I'm speaking on behalf of the Federation, SAFTU, the South African Federation of Trade Unions, the second largest federation that unfortunately has become part of the cry of the excluded in terms of our participation, not just in NEDLEC, but in every other aspect of transformation in our society, which is a discussion for another day. We are joining the rest of the formations under the coalition on COVID-19 who have endorsed this statement that have just been read to you, to demand the continuation of the payment of the special grants that was made by the government in response to the reality that so many people will find themselves on the other side of the negative impact of COVID in South Africa. And we recognize that the 350 rand itself was tokenist, and that's why we in particular happy that the demand of the coalition is that as a stopgap measure, the amount be increased to just over 500 rands, which itself falls way below the poverty line of 1,300 rands. And that's why we continue to march in the streets to demand that the government, without any further delay, must introduce a basic income grant. And our view is that the basic income grant should be above the poverty line. And also the basic income grant itself is not necessarily the end of the road in terms of us addressing the levels of poverty in our country. Anybody who lives on 1,300, in our view, still lives in poverty. And anybody who lives below 12,500 is still living in poverty in our view. And that's why we see a link between the need to transform the economy fundamentally, to give the unemployed people their best price of an escape from poverty, which is employment at the living wage. And so we know the ravaging and the devastating impact of poverty during the COVID, which started around February, March in the whole world. In South Africa, we've seen 2.2 million workers losing their jobs, adding to a 10.8 million people who were already unemployed before COVID. South Africa was already sitting at position number 6 in the whole world when it comes to unemployment rate, and we're sitting already with position number 1 when it comes to youth unemployment. And we were already sitting at position number 1 when it comes to inequalities. Anybody can imagine what happens to all of these people when you take 2.2 million of them and add them to that long queue of the unemployed. You can just imagine the devastating impact this have had, in particular to women in our society who have become the face of that 2.2 million people who have lost their jobs. Our call is to our government. Please listen to the voices of the people as represented by the People's Coalition. Extend the grant to at least the end of this financial year, and beyond the financial year, introduce the basic income grant as a stop measure itself, whilst we're working to ensure that we address the sources, the real reason behind the economic system that reproduces poverty, unemployment, and inequalities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade. I will now call on Comrade Prince Tamane, who's the community leader and youth activist from Tsakane, Gauteng.
Good morning to everyone who is part of this meeting, this press conference, which was urgently noticed to us. We would like to thank every media house that took the opportunity to join us. We would also like to thank all the leaders, community leaders, business people, and the leaders of the non-profit organizations who have joined us today. Today, we are here to discuss the Social Relief Distress Program, which was confirmed in the regulations made under Section 27 of the Disaster Management Act 2002. This act provides for an integrated and coordinated disaster management policy in South Africa that focuses on preventing and reducing risk of distress, emergency preparedness, rapid and effective response to disasters, and post-disaster recovery. Now, the 350 grants were part of the response to the COVID-19 to avoid distress in the South African citizens. Now we are pleading with the South African government to extend the grants and increase them to 585 rand per month until post-disaster recovery plan is made in place, which at this point we see it as being the universal basic income guarantee. The grant must be extended until a comprehensive plan for the BIG is put in place. As it is well known that due to COVID-19, over 2.2 million jobs will be lost or already lost, and a lapse in these payments will push many households into deeper distress than before. This means that the 350 grant is clearly helping the people and cannot be just ended without a proper plan in place. The 350 grant is open to applicants who are not beneficiaries of any other social security grant or UIF payment and are not currently receiving income. And there is no guarantee that by the end of October, all these people will have other means or source of income. So the government must ensure that these people are protected from distress, because once they are pushed to poverty, that may lead to increase in crime rate in our country. Therefore, we call upon all the organizations in South Africa and the South Africans to bring their innovative, creative solutions to the possibilities, design, and scale of the big solution. Till then, the grants should be extended to at least the end of this financial year and increased towards 585 rand per month. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Prince Tamane. I will now call on Comrade Zama Mthunzi, who is from the Equal Education Gauteng Regional, or rather, who is the Equal Education Gauteng Regional Organizer.
Hi, greetings to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in this press conference, a very critical issue that we're discussing here. I think as young people, we know that things like starvation, hunger, and access to opportunity for young people are bad in this country. As Equal Education, after we did our investigations in the townships and the villages, in terms of access to food in the crisis, we saw that there's serious problems there, and that a lot of people in this country go to bed without have eaten. We then were forced to take the Department of Basic Education to court for them to reinstate the school nutrition program. This is the same thing that is happening with a majority of young people. South Africa is the highest youth unemployment in the world, and that a lot of young people are stuck in the streets, are stuck in the villages, and have no access to means of survival. And I think as Equal Education, we've realized that in all fairness, we must take on this campaign and make sure that the department doesn't take away the grant. But I think we must also emphasize how this grant and who is directed to affect young people who are under the age of 35 and have no access to education, have no access to work opportunities, and they're being pushed to the streets, they're being pushed to find other forms of survival, while we have a government that is supposed to care for the people, and we have to push the government to maintain the grant until we think around implementing a basic income grant. So we endorse the campaign. We want to mobilize for the campaign as young people to join in the streets to make sure that Department of Social Development reconsiders the decision to cancel the grant. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Comrade. Now I would like to call on Isabel Fryer, who will also be speaking on behalf of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to the organizers of this. Just to say that my message is actually brought from community constituency, with apologies from our overall convener, Comrade Thuli, who wasn't able to join, given the urgent nature of this press conference. So to say that community constituency and its member organizations support this initiative to call for an extension of the current grants. We know that COVID-19 is a global pandemic. Its impact is unprecedented. We know that orthodoxy in terms of uncertainty is not something that we can put specific choices on without any unknown consequences flowing from it. Community constituency represents women, we represent the youth, we represent cooperative movement, people living with disabilities, SANCO, and the Financial Sector Campaigns Coalition. What we want to talk specifically about is the fact that even prior to COVID, South Africa was in unprecedented economic downturn. We had a 2-quarter recession in terms of the global economy, and for the majority of people, this was felt through the loss of jobs. What we want to refer to is the fact that the most recent quarterly labour force survey showed that while narrow definition of unemployment had fallen, the broad definition had increased. For us, this shows the danger that for the majority of ordinary South Africans, the formal economy and the kinds of initiatives that are going to creating jobs are becoming completely delinked from their own realities. This is crucial not only for our democracy, but for our ongoing forms of political engagement and, of course, the constitutional rights and guarantees that come to everybody. We think that if you look to the kind of research that has come through the NIDS CRAM report, as well as the work that the IEJ and other civil society coalitions have done, it's clear that the current grants that are being paid are the only initiative that stand between ordinary people and complete destitution and starvation. We know as community constituency that the research shows that the grants are not anywhere near meeting people's basic needs. We are part of broader ongoing engagement with government through various structures to look at overall comprehensive social security reform. This is not that. What we're calling for today, and we're joining the call of the broader coalition of civil society activists, is for urgent humanitarian decisions to be made, and these include extending the current grants. We are aware that there are a variety of calls for the different levels of the grant to be extended. Right now, as community constituency, we would call for an extension of the current grants with a reconvening to consider the greater expansion of the grant income at the end of this financial year. We also call on government urgently to meet with this coalition and other leaders of civil society and the Labour Federation today or tomorrow in order to look at the impact of these and provide a strong message to people in South Africa that government has not forgotten them, that they themselves, ordinary people, are at the heart of recovery. And we thank you for this time.
Thank you, Comrade. I'll now call on Comrade Daddy Mabe, who's from the Assembly of the Unemployed and a grant claimant.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity, and also thank you to the organizers of this conference, and special greetings to the People's Protector, Advocate Thuli Madonsela. I still regard you as the People Protector, Advocate Thuli. And therefore, on behalf of myself as a grant recipient, the 350 grant recipient, and the whole other people who are in my situation, a similar situation, and the Assembly of the Unemployed in particular, I also wish to express my endorsement for the call for the extension and the increase of these grants, at least until the end of the financial year. And if I could also kindly ask you to allow me to re-emphasize some of the points that were made by the previous speakers, which are hinged, most of them, by what the People's Protector raised, that there is nothing without a cost. Now, we want our government, or we wish that our government could bear that in mind. You know, one looks around our area, you find that there is vandalism of the infrastructure. We have no longer have trains that are traveling around because people try everything to survive. We don't want to promote thuggery and all sorts of crimes. And therefore, we need our government to help in this regard, you know, work with us so that at least we minimize and we make it difficult for people who are doing wrong things to justify their actions. Also, to re-emphasize the issue of the problems with regards to the application from SASSA. You know, from our experience as the unemployed people here, you find that the local SASSA offices have been, incapacitated to can be able to assist where people experience problems with their applications, or maybe their follow-up situations. You know, you talk to the local managers, they tell you, as far as these grants are concerned, there is nothing we can do for you. You have to talk to the national or the regional office, which is a problem because most people don't have cell phones. Those who have cell phones do not have the capacity to can utilize them optimally. So which results in a lot of frustration to a lot of people. And again, I find myself having to perhaps highlight one other thing that I feel it's very personal and it's also a story of many people. You know, there's this assumption from the government, you know, if one has to reflect from how far have we come with this universal basic income grant story, that people that want these grants are people that are lazy who do not want to work. That's an insult. Personally, I lost my formal employment in 2001. And between 2001 and at least up until 3 years back, I was able to run around and fend for myself. It becomes a daily struggle every day. Sometimes you are lucky, you get enough money. Sometimes it's so difficult. Sometimes it takes you something like 48 hours just to organize 20 rand to feed your family. Because I've got 2 adult children. One is a graduate. Both of them are unemployed. I'm not employed. I still have a bond to pay. And somebody goes around and say, if you give these people grants, you make them lazy. Yes, this is an insult. In any case, the point is that ultimately we find ourselves in a situation where even if when you try to mobilize the community against crime, for them to work against crime and vandalism, and they tell you, look, if I stop somebody from doing crime, what do I have to give to them in replacement of what they are doing? And that becomes a very serious moral question that we have to deal with. And now this is very serious, and our wish and praise that the government take this call very serious, because on the ground where we're staying, we have evidence of the repercussions of our failure as a nation to have genuine solidarity with those that are excluded, those who are disadvantaged. The other issue that comes to mind is the issue of opulence for those who are privileged enough to have jobs. You know, we have to highlight this thing, because to us who are unemployed, it does not make sense that a person that is employed under these circumstances, they don't see it fit to can support the call for grants. First, secondly, they don't see it fit for them to put strain into the national opportunity.
Thank you, comrade, for those remarks. We are losing you there on the network, but I think your message was very clear. I'll now call on Isan Basia, who is a Selju researcher. Comrade, please take the floor.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm a researcher who's been working on, who's worked on the NIDS CAM data, and so I just want to talk about 3 simple facts from our situation that support the call to extend the social relief of distress and caregiver grants. The first point, which has been repeated multiple times, is that COVID-19 has devastated employment. So we can see that from the best estimates of representative surveys from NIDS-CRAM, from QLFS, something like 2.5 million fewer jobs on net there've been 2.5 million fewer jobs on net. And important in this is that these losses look likely to persist. The quick gains in recovery have been exhausted. In other words, workers who are meant to go back to work from leave have already gone back. And if we look at the translation from these job losses into poverty, our estimates show that 20 to 40% of these job losers were pushed into poverty. So if we take into account dependents, something like 2 to 3 million more people have been pushed into poverty over the last few months. And that's under the current regime where we have the grant top-ups. Now, the second quick point I want to make is that grants can and have decreased poverty. Of course, employment has been a policy emphasis, and it's been shown to be an alleviator of poverty. But unfortunately, unemployment has remained stagnant for the last 3 decades at extremely high levels. Youth employment, for example, as previous speaker Zama said. And we can see here that grants, especially at the bottom, if we look at the green over here, grants have been crucial in cushioning the worst off, the poorest households in South Africa. In other words, something like 80% of the income from the poorest households come from grants. And really, this has been, this role of grants has carried through into the COVID-19. So from our best estimates, we really can see that the social relief of distress grant by itself has had an enormous poverty impact. Even by July, where only 10% of adults were covered by social relief of distress grant, something like poverty was decreased by something like 2%, or the equivalent of something like 1 million people, fewer people in extreme poverty because of the social relief of distress grant. And so this is really one of the bases of saying that accounting for the increased social relief of distress grant coverage, because it's rolled out much more between July and now, and if we account for the caregiver grant, an estimated 4 to 5 million people have been pulled out of extreme poverty through these crucial social relief of distress grant and caregiver grants. The final point I want to make is that South Africa really has a uniquely high poverty rate given our average income. If we compare to similar countries with similar amount of average income, we have much higher poverty rate. And that's really inherited from apartheid. It's a social policy choice made by apartheid that was deeply racist in its underpinnings, which disregarded the humanity of Black poor people in this country and said that the high rates of poverty are something that we as a society can live with. The government, in its commitment to the NDP, made a commitment and undertaking to eliminate extreme poverty, to undo the apartheid structure of extreme poverty despite our high income levels. But even by 2017, a Stats SA report has shown that the country has in fact lost ground on the war on poverty. In other words, many years later, by 2015, according to Stats SA, poverty had in fact increased rather than decreased as committed by the NDP. And so the question really remains, how else can we reach the commitment from government to eliminate poverty in the most unequal country in the world, South Africa, if not taking this opportunity, this necessary opportunity to extend the grant system and address poverty. So to wrap up, really the point is why should the grants be extended? Because 4 to 5 million people are estimated to be pushed into extreme poverty if the social relief, distress and caregiver grants are withdrawn. At the same time, there's been a lot of talk about jobs and recovery program, which is crucial, but that will take time. And in the meanwhile, something is needed to cushion it. And these grants were meant to address the COVID crisis, which is really far from over. even aside from the continuous crisis that the country is in terms of unemployment and poverty. And finally, this is really an opportunity to reach the commitment to eliminate the extreme poverty. We have system capability following the massive rollout of the social of the stress grant to the unemployed. And at the end of the day, as Prof. Thuli Madonsela said, there's really no justification for allowing the level of extreme poverty that we have, especially given that we're the most unequal country in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Thank you to all who have joined us today. We have received apologies from Kosatu, but they will be releasing a statement later today. Thank you to all the people who've given remarks. Thank you to the Coalition and the Institute for Economic Justice for putting together the statement. We urge all people who are on this call and representing their organizations and at individual capacities to endorse the statement such that it reaches far and wide, and to share it as well critically. That is all from me, Busisi Bego, a researcher and economist at the Institute for Economic Justice. We hope that you will all amplify the voices of those who have spoken here today. Thank you. Okay, I am back. I thought so. I've heard that there are some questions, and I'm wondering if the speakers and some people will take on these questions. The coalition writers of the statement. One of the questions that I'm seeing here is: has there been contact with the National Treasury, which is being asked by Mark Hayward? Shara, I'll ask you to respond to that question.
Yes, thank you, Busi. From a coalition perspective, we had presented when the adjusted budget was being debated earlier this year. We had presented to Parliament and we had shared our reservations about the grants being temporary, number one, but also about the fact that the amount of the grants was too low. 350 Rand is below the food poverty line. And as Ihsan's presentation has so clearly shown, while there have been a lot of issues with accessing the grant, and the grant also has been very low, its benefits cannot be disputed. So we have to have a continuation of these grants. I think the challenge with National Treasury is that a lot of them are clearly so detached from the ground that they think that since the lockdown has now come to a lesser degree, there's opportunities for people to make money, but we all know that that is not true. In fact, even before COVID-19, we had a crisis in our economy with more than half of our population part of the working poor. So even people who did have jobs were not having enough money to live a dignified life. And this is why with the C19 People's Coalition and the Cash Transfers Working Group, our demand has been that yes, we need a better social security system and we need to have the urgent extension and increasing of these grants. But we also need to understand that until we don't have basic income guarantees that are at a dignified level, we'll always be having the same challenges and poverty will continue to increase. So for us, it's really seeing the COVID grant as a gateway to a basic income guarantee. And so the removal of the COVID grant would take us backwards to a large extent because millions of people have benefited from now being included in the social security system when previously they were not included, despite the fact that unemployment is structural in South Africa. So we urge National Treasury to take their heads out of the sand and to really understand the challenges that people are facing. And Comrade Daddy Mabe, who is also part of the Cash Transfers Working Group with us, has very clearly stated the challenges that he and millions of other people face in South Africa as part of the unemployed.
Thank you. There was another question here around why the amount is over 500 Rand as opposed to 1,250. I believe this question was asked when Comrade Zwelinzima Vavi was speaking. So I'll give the floor to both Shara as well as Comrade Vavi to comment. And if any of the other speakers would like to add, we all welcome that as well.
I will let Comrade Vavi go first.
Okay, let me repeat what I was saying, that in our view, the 350 rands a whole month represented the worst insult on the between 60 and 70 people or percent of our people who are trapped in poverty, that is degrading, that is robbing themselves of their dignity. And a 550 is not far from that at all. In our view, it's still tokenist. It still will not lift our people out of the levels of poverty, and it will still remain wholly inadequate to address their levels of poverty and hopelessness. And that's why in our view, and that's why we were in the streets on the 7th of October to demand that the basic income grant must be introduced without any further delay. We have submitted the Section 77 notice at NEDLEC to demand that the basic income grant be tagged at an amount of 1,500 rands. And we have submitted a demand to NEDLEC to demand that no worker must earn below 12,500 except in very exceptional circumstances where it is quite clear that the employer may genuinely not be able to pay that 12,500 and resulting into rather job losses and therefore a crisis for the very same workers that are employed at this moment. But our demand remains. So we have no qualms whatsoever to endorse the statement, even though we feel that 550 is itself tokenist, because this is addressing an immediate challenge. The immediate challenge is that the government wants to remove even the tokenist 350 rands at the end of this month. We do recognize that removing that 350 rands will spell a disaster for the over 6 million people who have benefited from it. Looks 350, very small, but this is 350 rands that an unemployed young person can use to get into the taxi. Sorry that there are no trains and buses left anymore. To get into the taxis and to go search for employment opportunities in town. It does make, even though a small difference to the standards of living of the unemployed. And it must be understood to be an interim measure that we are demanding that it must remain during the crisis that government itself have recognized that it has to address and ameliorate the crisis that so many millions of our people will otherwise find themselves in. So that's the context, and people must see a link between the special grant that was introduced and the need to maintain that special grant beyond end of October whilst going towards the financial year, and then to introduce a basic income grant that will offload many people from poverty. And then once we're demanding an economy that will address inequalities, poverty, and unemployment. So that's how we see the link between all of these demands. And I hope that I've answered the question. By the way, can we take this opportunity to say this? We fear that the Treasury will, on the 21st of March, announce further assaults on the standards of living of the poorest of the poor through the austerity programs that may make the austerity that we have experienced between 2008 and to date, in particular the austerity programs that were introduced in March and in June in response to the COVID crisis, all look like a Sunday school picnic. And that's where we must say we remain disgusted, because from what we hear from the president, including the speech that is apparently going to be making on Thursday, you can say that maybe the government is beginning to take its head out of the sand, is beginning to respond to the crisis of an economy that was always in crisis before the COVID. But on the other hand, the same government may announce massive cuts that are going to be focused on the frontline service delivery areas after the 21st of March. And the call, therefore, is to the People's Coalition to anticipate and to begin to ensure that we discuss this threat with the organization and the people that we represent, so that we may continue to demonstrate in the streets to demand the continuation of the special grant at 550, whilst demanding the speediest possible introduction of the basic income grant, demanding an economy that will not be inclusive from the rhetoric point of view, but will be inclusive in reality felt by our people marginalized in the informal settlements all over the country and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sherry, I don't know if you had anything to add with regards to that response specifically.
No, I think the response has been noted. What I will just say is that the main challenge we're seeing at the moment is that if these grants are not extended, more than 6.8 million people will be plunged into living below the poverty line. And that for me is the question that we have to ask government. Under their watch, will they allow this to happen? I mean, we do know that the government, that hunger is not a new thing in South Africa. We've had a population of almost 12 to 13 million people who've been food insecure, even before COVID-19. But those numbers have been more exacerbated in the context we find ourselves in. And so I think seeing this as a crisis is paramount, and allowing civil society to be part of the conversations that take place on how we will deal with this crisis is something we've been demanding from the very beginning of the lockdown. And unfortunately, we've been sidelined by government. And now we're having to deal with the repercussions. It's been civil society that has stepped up to take food to communities. It's been civil society that has stepped up to ensure that there are shelters that are following protocols to create a safe environment for people to socially distance and for the homeless. And it's been civil society that's been highlighting the needs of communities in this time. Government has been very much absent, and when they have been present, it's been inadequate. And so we do need to work together with government, but we are really pleading that these issues are taken seriously as we move forward into this period of nothing close to a recovery. The crisis is still going to get worse, in my opinion, as we might even enter a second wave of infections.
Thank you, Comrade. Before we go to our last question, I'd like to give the floor to Comrade Isabel, who had a response to one of the earlier questions.
Thanks very much, Busi. I was just responding to your question about National Treasury. So as part of community constituency within NEDLAC, we have occasion to engage with government, including National Treasury. There has been an ongoing process around social security increase, as I alluded to, including research around the basic income grant. On this point in specific, we were engaging with Treasury last Tuesday, and we were asking an opportunity to share current research around the need to extend, at least extend the current social grants. And we were told that the opportunity was not available to engage. We think that this is an extremely unfortunate position that Treasury communicated. We think that now is the time to be sharing best brains and thinking rather than limiting people's thoughts to orthodox kind of economic considerations and theories. And so as community constituency with a broader platform of civil society organizations, we're calling on the presidency for us to be able to meet either this afternoon or early tomorrow morning before finalization of the economic recovery principles are made and before the president announces the ease on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade, for that response. I think it is an important follow-up of the engagements with Treasury. There's a very important question here that says, what if the National Treasury does not extend the grants? Will you take urgent court action to extend the grants if Treasury refuses? What other action? I believe that someone from Black Sash is able to comment on this. If no one from Black Sash is on this call, I'd like to call on Comrade Shara again, who can give us some insight into that question.
Yeah, I think that Comrade Huda was on the call, but she isn't at this moment. I think, Abigail, are you from Black Sash?
Hi, good morning, everybody. It's Huda speaking. I'm at the meeting. I came in late because I was just busy in other meetings. So just to give some input from our side, we support the call for an extension of the COVID grant as well as the caregiver grant. We are obviously concerned in terms of the lack of income for those between 18 to 59 years. And this forms part of our broader campaign asking for basic income support for those who are unemployed or those who receive no or little income. So we are considering our options to hold government to account. And so we will keep you posted with developments this week and see what the president is going to announce on Thursday.
Thank you for those remarks. I'm just looking here to see if there are any further questions before we close off our session.
May I say a word, ma'am? Program Director.
Excuse me, sorry?
May I say a word?
Sure, please go ahead.
Thank you. And the question is, what are we going to do if government doesn't respond? I think we would have to push, because coming into this dialogue, I also come from not just broadly social justice, but also from an experience of gender dynamics in society. And I do think that if this grant is withdrawn now in the middle of the impact of the lockdown, women are going to pay the price and girls are going to pay the price. Firstly, from the point of view of bearing the burden of care, but secondly, because we do know that when there's distress, violence increases, and those who are vulnerable to that violence would be girls and women, particularly older women. We would therefore urge government to do everything possible. And we do know that there isn't a pot of gold. There's no suggestion that there is a pot of gold somewhere that can cover this. It's a question of shifting this money from somewhere else. And one area that needs to be revisited again are the privileges of people in government, including security. Some of the amount of security that is provided to people in government is superfluous. It's unnecessary. South Africa is not the most dangerous country in Africa, but the kinds of security that we provide to members of the executive and others is far excessive for a country like ours. I do think that the money can be shifted from other places to make sure that this grant continues, this grant continues to be covered. And we're not saying this just from thumb-sucking. The need cramps study that our colleague Persia just referred to, again, is evidence-based, and government can look at that. I just want to say, going forward, we don't want women to pay for government's mistakes. And therefore, we will do everything in our power to make sure that government understands that somebody has to pay for this. It's better that we all do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments, advocates. We have come to the end of our session. Again, I'd like to thank the speakers for having been a part of this. And I'd like to extend a special thank you to Jan Oberholzer, who is our South African Sign Language interpreter today. This should be common practice across all our meetings to ensure that we're extending accessibility to all people who want to be a part of this platform, and not to those who have been privileged in the past to be a part of these discussions. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to engaging with you on this work, and look forward to more endorsements by other organizations who are joining us today. Thank you.